Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. This is Father John Paul from the Tantor Ecumenical Institute in Jerusalem, and it's a pleasure to welcome you all back wherever you are, be it in Europe, the Middle East, in the US, Australia, the Philippines, Pakistan. Welcome back. I'm here at Tantor with the rest of our ecumenical office staff, Father Jonas and Sister Marie Feruza, as well as others, our partners in Geneva and elsewhere. So Father Jonas will give some details about today's session. And so, Father Jonas.
Hello, thank you, Father GP. A big welcome to each one of you. It's good to see your faces and to have you with us again today. Today is the third session on the series of 4 with Jared Goldfarb. If last week we discovered who were the people, the neighbors, let's say, present in the Holy Land at the time of Jesus, the different Jewish communities, today Jared is going to explore with us this important question: did Jesus go to the temple or synagogue? And the idea, the navigating between the priestly rituals and the rabbinic teachings. As you may know already, we have a 45-minute session will be followed by a time for question and answers. And you can chat your question and answers into the chat box. So that will be for the end of the presentation. And when this presentation will be finished, we'll have a time of spiritual reflection with Father Jean-Paul, Director of Tantor. So I'm wishing to each one of you a good session. And Jared, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Greetings from Jerusalem, from my room in Jerusalem. Happy to continue our journey through this contextual world of Jesus from 2,000 years ago. Last week when we wrapped up, you may remember we did like a quick recap of our visit to Caesarea, to Caesarea Maritima, and specifically noted that the various institutions that were being constructed as part of that city were very much a kind of an iconic representation of this new-ish Roman culture that had really gained a foothold and had been increasingly influencing the local culture. And we ended with a sort of a humorous look through the eyes of Monty Python at the way the rabbinic world were grappling with these new institutions, these new challenges in the world, in the Jewish world of Judea, and for that matter of the Galilee at this time, during the lifetime of Jesus. And so we saw how that clip, the famous clip of "What have the Romans ever done for us?" was indeed rooted in a Talmudic text that, at least symbolically speaking, took 3 rabbinic positions in the form of 3 well-known rabbis and kind of played them out in perhaps a pretend conversation, where we saw one rabbi who was very anti-Roman culture and said that everything they're doing for evil, and therefore implying that the Jews should have nothing to do with these Roman institutions in the Roman world, and that they should really sort of hunker down and preserve whatever boundaries may still exist, protecting Jewish tradition and Jewish practice. There was then another rabbi, Rabbi Yossi, who was silent amongst this perhaps heated conversation. And in the end, we learned that he was exiled to a city called Sepphoris, that sort of outside of the Talmudic context, we know was well respected for being a city of coexistence, where there was a Roman community and a Jewish community that lived side by side. And so perhaps Rabbi Yossi's silence was somehow implying that if one wasn't too vocal one way or the other, one could sort of just get by and live with the other, even if the other was potentially threatening. And lastly, we saw we read the voice of Rabbi Yehuda, who essentially praised this Roman reality. And in a way, maybe is the forebearer of breaking the necessary ground in order to find creative ways to integrate this wonderful Jewish history into this new reality and to become somewhat adaptable, perhaps to further the chances of survival, given that it was probably quite clear to many Jews, certainly amongst the Jewish leadership 2,000 years ago during the time of Jesus, that these tensions were coming to a boil and could potentially bring some sort of downfall to the Jewish people. And of course, we all know where history is heading, so that is not so much of a spoiler. So I want to pick up where we left off and take a look. If today we're going to try to juggle between the world of the temple versus the world of the rabbis, and perhaps wonder where Jesus fit in best, although I don't think it's really too much of a surprise, I want to continue with our rabbinic exploration briefly before we head to the world of the temple, which will be sort of our visual experience for today's class. If you will, I'm going to share my screen. Oops, hold on. Here we go. Okay, so you should all see now another Talmudic text on your screen. Remember, we're sort of playing off of the specific Roman institutions that we explored together, saw together on our virtual tour of Caesarea a couple of weeks ago. And so here in the Babylonian Talmud, again from about the 5th century of the Common Era, in the tractate entitled Avodah Zarah, which literally means foreign worship, right? A whole tractate basically devoted to this concept of perhaps what Jews should not be engaged in. We read a rabbinic exposition on the first verse in the book of Psalms. As it says, "Happy is the man who has not followed the counsel of the wicked, or stood on the path of the sinner, or sat in the seat of the scornful." So while we could read that literally, and probably did so in the Jewish tradition for many, many generations, the Talmud is going to take, obviously, an interpretive approach. And so the rabbis taught, one who goes to a stadium where people are killed in contests with gladiators or beasts, this is the seat of the scornful. This raises a contradiction from another rabbinic source that says one is permitted to go to a stadium because he can scream and save the life of a Jew. So this is an interesting text because it actually gives us a couple of different options how, as a Jew, we might understand whether or not we're allowed to integrate into this particular Roman institution, or we are allowed to participate. So on one hand, we shouldn't be going to any of these institutions because the rabbis are interpreting the verse from Psalms to say that the seat of the scornful is not metaphorical. It is not an allegory for anything. According to this particular interpretation, it is a literal seat in the stadium, right? To sit in that stadium is in fact the seat of the scornful, and you are clearly transgressing the will of God. However, the Talmud raises that there was another rabbinic conversation that is quoted in another passage that mentions that perhaps it's okay to go to that same seat of the scornful, because if you scream loud enough, you may be able to save the life of a Jew. What is the reference here? If you've watched any movie about, the Roman traditions, documentary or like, the movie Gladiator, any of those sorts of things, you'll know that towards the end of what could be a very bloody battle between human or human and beast, oftentimes the tradition was that the audience would have a bit of a say in the fate of one of the actors, one of the participants in the arena, whether or not they wanted to see a little more blood and guts and the spilling of that person's blood, or whether they were in a good mood that day and maybe wanted to sort of save that person. We're not sure that this is historically accurate, but of course we know from movies that it usually involved a thumbs up or a thumbs down, right? There was a sort of moment, whether it's coming from the audience, maybe it's coming from the governor or the emperor who's in attendance. Nonetheless, the point is that maybe if you're there, and if you're an observant Jew, and if you know that your Jewish tradition calls upon you to always strive for preservation of human life, because of course it is a gift of God, then you will do your best to scream in favor of anyone who's about to lose their life. And maybe, just maybe, you can actually save a life that day, which ostensibly gives you points in your favor, right? And so we see how here the Talmud or the rabbinic conversation is tackling a very new subject, one that nowhere else in Jewish tradition before this would they ever have even discussed, because it simply wasn't relevant. There was no presence of such a contest that would raise these ethical issues, moral issues, traditional issues. Continuing on, we have another rabbinic piece from that same Babylonian Talmud, although this one happens to fall in Tractate Shabbat, although it really has nothing to do with the Sabbath per se, but it's a relatively similar discussion. We read here, Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani said, in the name of Rabbi Yonatan, on Shabbat, it is permitted to go to the theaters, to the circuses, and to the basilicas in order to observe matters of public interest. So now here we see a slightly broader rabbinic perspective, right? One that not specifically is worried about the actions that are taking place in any particular institution, but rather commenting on how at large the Jews, or at least these Jews, the rabbinic Jews participating in these conversations, were keenly aware that their autonomy, their control over society in Judea, perhaps in the Galilee, had started to wane. And that in fact, the more vibrant spheres of influence during the time of Jesus were now becoming the Roman spaces, the places that, at least on the face of it, many Jews were probably very hesitant to go for fear of either transgressing some sort of Jewish law, or maybe just because they would feel as other, right? They would feel kind of beyond the spectrum of traditional Roman society. So here there is a specific rabbinic permission to be able to go to those spaces in order to observe matters of public interest, meaning any conversation, any debate about public policy, government, budgets, religion, you name it, that could be of interest to local Jews. And maybe, just maybe, they should be a part of those conversations, because as you feel more and more other in a world of increasing quote unquote cultural invasion, you want to stand up for your identity and your place in society for fear of being outnumbered or run out. And so another really just fascinating quick glimpse into that perspective of the rabbis. One could raise the question whether or not these rabbis are sort of prophesiers in a sense, right? Looking towards the future and engaging their Jewish community to go out and be a part of these social constructs in order to play whatever role maybe the rabbis feel that they should be playing. It might also be interesting to contemplate, right? Those of us looking in hindsight back in history, that maybe these rabbis weren't in fact prophets. Maybe they were simply reacting to a situation whereby they were witnessing more and more Jews in their midst, something that we also see happening in the text of the New Testament, who are anyways participating in Roman institutions, Roman lifestyle. And rather than risk the chance of those Jews become more identified with Rome and perhaps start to drift away from a historic Jewish identity, those rabbis are creating almost a false construct whereby the Jews who are anyway leaving the fold, so to speak, and going to engage in Roman culture may still be able to feel their Jewishness, right? So it's more of a reactive situation, perhaps, than a prescribed situation. Again, we don't know for sure, but it is interesting to contemplate, right, in which direction rabbinic wisdom goes. Are they foreseeing the future, or are they simply reacting to a very challenging situation, and they want to make sure that the Jewish world at large isn't lost to this very tempting but new and somewhat foreign culture? I'll give another example, one that's a little bit too detailed perhaps, but nonetheless a fascinating text. This one from the Mishnah. You'll remember we discussed very briefly last week. The Mishnah was the predecessor to the Talmud, the first compilation of the rabbinic oral tradition, compiled in the 2nd, 3rd centuries of the Common Era. This one from that same tractate of Avodah Zarah, foreign worship. And here we read that Proclus, the son of Plosphos, asked Rabban Gamliel a question in Akko, where he was washing in Aphrodite's bathhouse. He said, "Isn't it written in your Torah, let nothing that has been prohibited stick to your hand? How then do you bathe in Aphrodite's bathhouse?" Rabban Gamliel replied, "One does not respond to questions of Torah in the bathhouse." However, once he exited, Rabban Gamliel said to him, "I did not enter her domain, she entered mine." Furthermore, no one says, let's make a bathhouse as a decoration for Aphrodite. Rather, they say, let's make a statue of Aphrodite as a decoration for a bathhouse. So just a pause from the text here for a minute. I just want to point out what Rabban Gamliel seems to be saying, in my opinion, is really about precedence. Who, or specifically whose tradition, was here first? According to Rabban Gamliel, either, right, you can look at it in a very, very microcosmic way, in that, okay, fine, you're in a bathhouse, no big deal. Jews use water. It could have been an innocent bathhouse, but they stuck a statue of Aphrodite in there and sort of as an afterthought, so it doesn't really affect the nature of the bathhouse. Or on a little bit more of a macro level, he's also arguing that he essentially pre-exists the entire notion of the Roman bathhouse, right? She came into his domain, of course, being the sacred land of Israel. And so whether you're not, it's a Roman bathhouse, it's his land, it's his space, and therefore he should feel comfortable being there, even if it now seems to be in the form of a perhaps prohibited institution. So very interesting rabbinic logic kind of going on there, but he continues and makes it even more interesting. So go back to the middle of that paragraph where we read, rather they say, let's make a statue of Aphrodite as a decoration. Another reason, moving ahead, another reason. Even if someone paid you lots of money, you wouldn't commence your idol worship if you were naked or impure from ejaculation, nor would you urinate before your sacred object. But this statue of Aphrodite stands over the sewer, and everyone urinates before it. If a statue is treated as a god, then it is forbidden. But if it is not treated as a god, then it is permitted to be in its presence. Again, I love this text because it's so creative in the way that it just flips everything on its head. And basically what Rabban Gamliel is saying is, really, we can find a way to make nothing forbidden anymore if we simply reinterpret that thing in the same way that we, the rabbis, have a tradition of reinterpreting God's words, right? We can sort of make something into a law, or we can turn something away from being some sort of transgression or prohibition. Keep in mind that not only is the statue of Aphrodite problematic because of sort of this pantheistic kind of problem vis-a-vis monotheism, but also remember that any kind of image is strictly forbidden according to Torah law. Remember the 10 Commandments? You shall have no graven images. So even if it's not a god, any image could be slightly problematic. And what we see here is one of the various rabbinic texts that is going to move the Jewish tradition, perhaps unintentionally, in the direction of artistic appreciation. Meaning, even if it has nothing to do with idol worship, you're sort of enabling a runaround of the 10 Commandments, literally, by saying, oh, the graven image in question in the 10 Commandments is really about religious worship. If you're just treating it as an object and not as a god, then maybe my God, the monotheistic God, wouldn't mind so much. So all of a sudden, and it's not a coincidence that around the time of Jesus and around the time of the early rabbinic tradition, we see Jewish artistic representation in a way that never existed, as far as we know, in earlier times, because of this ability to reinterpret. So again, another fantastic example of how we see this rabbinic debate revolving around the world that Jesus knows very, very well at the time. I want to share two more really quick texts, and then we're going to move to our more visual experience today. And these are just, again, very kind of general approaches to how the rabbis are starting to see the ever-encompassing Roman world around them. So here's a Talmudic text from the Tractate of Sanhedrin, which, of course, Sanhedrin is the rabbinic court of law. And we read, it is taught, a Torah scholar is not permitted to reside in any city that does not have these 10 things: a court that has the authority to flog and punish, a charity fund, a synagogue, a bathhouse, a public bathroom, a doctor, a bloodletter, a scribe, a ritual slaughterer, and a teacher of young children. Now, while we could easily argue that some of those public institutions are clearly very much in concert with Jewish tradition and practice, some of them maybe not so much. And so we start to see, again, this world of, if you're going to be a Torah scholar, maybe you need to be in a place where you're going to have some sort of influence, where you can reach out and create policy, if you will, by reacting to the realities of the time, as opposed to retreating to your nice, comfortable Jewish bubble, where you don't have perhaps as much of an expansive influence. Keep in mind, as I'm reading these texts, right, the text that I assume you are all very familiar with from the New Testament, where we see Jesus sometimes also breaking out into the public sphere and teaching, and then even more specifically, the disciples of Jesus, for example, Paul, who is going to move far beyond even the Jewish world in trying to teach and convince and bring some sort of, moral compass to the world. It does sometimes involve going outside of your comfort zone, outside of your boundaries. The last text I'll share before we move on is from the Jerusalem Talmud, the complementary volume to the Babylonian Talmud, from the Tractate of Shabbat, where we read that the house of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi would permit 3 things: that one may look in a mirror, that one may get a Roman haircut, and that one should teach their children Greek, since they would need access to the empire. Again, another interesting little window into the world of this rabbinic discussion, in seeing how the rabbis perhaps are even seeing value in not just being present in a Roman sphere, maybe not even going into a bathhouse with an idol in it, but literally almost fully integrating into that society, perhaps in order to get the access they need, which maybe they see as a return on investment, right? They're going to be able to continue and to strengthen Jewish identity by being present in the world around them, as opposed to becoming a smaller and maybe more geographically bounded minority in this ever-growing world of Roman culture. So this is the world, I think, certainly from my perspective, that Jesus inhabited. This very creative, interpretive tradition is one that I think Jesus clearly embraced, and we see that in many, many different texts. And then maybe we'll come back to that particular issue if we have time. But before we run out of time, I want to make sure to get to our sort of virtual experience today, in that the kind of other side of the coin of this very interpretive, very creative rabbinic tradition was, of course, a little bit more of the staid tradition of the priestly families and the worship rituals in the temple in Jerusalem, right? So let us first remind ourselves perhaps where the notion of these core foundational rituals come from. And so here, if you look in the book of Deuteronomy, a text that'll probably be familiar to some of you, especially if you've ever learned with me before, it's one of my favorite texts, right before the Israelites cross into the promised land, and right before Moses dies, we have a retelling of the story and the laws, and this one kind of sums up perhaps one of the overarching essences of Jewish identity best of all. We read 3 times a year on the Feast of Matzot, on the Feast of Shavuot, and on the Feast of Sukkot. For those who don't know the Hebrew terms, that means the Feast of Passover, the Feast of Weeks, or the Feast of Pentecost, and the Feast of Tabernacles, okay? On those 3 festivals, all your males shall appear before the Lord your God in the place that God will choose. They shall not appear before God empty-handed, but each with his own gift, according to the blessing that the Lord your God has bestowed upon you. So here we have encapsulated in a very small verse this notion that God has a home and you have an obligation to show up at God's home, wherever that may be, and you have to bring the gifts that essentially you got from God anyways. It's this wonderful cycle back and forth. And so, of course, we know where this is going to lead us with the beauty of hindsight. We know eventually that there will be a tent of meeting, an Ark of the Covenant, a first tabernacle established at the city of Shiloh in northern Judea, what eventually becomes known as Samaria. Eventually, that structure is going to be formalized in the city of Jerusalem, linking, of course, to the earlier text of Abraham and Isaac, the near sacrifice and the consecration of the sacred hill. And so under Solomon, of course, the first temple is built, and that becomes the official site of pilgrimage, of Jewish pilgrimage. And so this tradition, one of, again, the core foundational principles of the Jewish relationship or the Israelite relationship with the one powerful deity, the one God, is going to really be focused through the institution of the temple in Jerusalem, with the assistance, of course, the catalyst of the priestly families. And so as we then move forward, jump back towards the time of Jesus, we read in Josephus what happens next. Hold on, I see it's not showing up on your screen. I don't know why. Let's try this again. Okay, there seems to be a problem with Zoom.
Try to stop share and to share it again, maybe.
Yes, I will do that. I don't know what's happening. I see, oh, there it is. I see it on my screen, but it took a while to show up on your screen. So here we're now looking at Josephus from his book on the antiquities of the Jews. And we read that King Herod, in the 18th year of his reign, undertook a very great task to build the temple of God. Technically, it should say rebuild the temple of God and make it larger in scope, to raise it to a most magnificent altitude, esteeming it to be the most glorious of all his actions, and to bring it to perfection. He prepared 1,000 wagons that were to bring stones for the building, selected 10,000 of the most skillful workmen. He bought 1,000 sacred garments for as many of the priests, and had some of them taught the arts of stonecutters and others of carpenters, and then began to build. And so King Herod, again, who is ruling right up until the birth of Jesus, is now undertaking the reconstruction of the temple, essentially to try to replicate the glory of Solomon's temple, given that when the Babylonians destroyed Solomon's temple in 586 BCE, the Jews or the Judeans essentially get carted off into Babylonian exile, only to return under the leadership of the Persians, King Cyrus, 50 years later. But when they rebuild the temple in Jerusalem, they don't have the resources to kind of recreate the glory of the past. And so many, many centuries go by until Herod decides that this is his calling to undertake the reconstruction of the temple, to make it just as glorious, perhaps even more glorious than it ever was. And this then, of course, not only is the tradition of Jesus handed down from his ancestors, but this now is going to become the physical experience of Jesus, thanks to Herod, right? Meaning Jesus kind of comes into the picture when the temple is now at its most glorious, probably since, the day it was even dreamed of as this manifestation of the God's space, where on these 3 festivals a year, all of the Israelites, all of the Jewish people can come and give their sacrifices as a way of essentially saying thank you for the blessing that God bestowed upon them. And so here we are now in Jerusalem. Well, there we go. Looking at a rough sketch of what the city looked like during the time of Jesus 2,000 years ago. And this was a reality that we have to assume Jesus was very familiar with, given his frequent appearances in the city, despite the fact that, of course, his home zone is, of course, the Galilee, the city of Nazareth, and then eventually the area around the Sea of Galilee. But of course, between the various pilgrimages, as well as the fact that Jerusalem was clearly an attractive epicenter of culture, religion, politics, you name it, there were probably lots of people who were eager to spend time in the city in order to either soak it up or dish it out, right? Depending on what role they were playing in Judean society. So we're looking here at a diagram of what was, at least in the ancient times, the largest that Jerusalem had really ever been, a very expansive city with a very well-established population. We can see, of course, in the upper right of the diagram, if you can see my mouse, the Temple Mount construct. We're going to get a closer look at that in a second. Over onto the left of the diagram, the large structure is the palace of King Herod, which some of you may know today sits at the Jaffa Gate, is known as the Tower of David Museum, even though it is clearly not a tower and has absolutely nothing to do with David. And then down here on the bottom of the diagram, you may recognize the famous pool of Siloam, which was one of the primary water resources in Jerusalem, not only for drinking and for all other domestic use, but also for the traditional bathing rituals, the mikveh, before one would ascend up onto the sacred mount, right? The temple structure here. Today, of course, atop that same structure, we see the Dome of the Rock, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, a very sacred space for Muslims around the world. And so I want to show you just very, very briefly the kind of the magic of how this new structure, the one that Jesus got to know, but those before him never got to know, how this sort of came about. So just a quick video here where you'll be able to see the walls going up around the sacred hill, the fill of the support structure, and then the platform on top. And then, of course, all of the institutional structures that facilitated pilgrimage, ritual, and of course, the priestly activities on the Temple Mount, right? Just a very quick look. We're going to get an inside look even closer in just a moment, but just so you can appreciate kind of how this structure came to be. We don't really have time to go into the architecture today, but let it be said that it was one of the most well-known structures in the known world 2,000 years ago, where many people very beyond the world of kind of this intimate Jewish temple tradition were commenting and writing about it. Moving forward, I just want to show you this one image. Some of you may recognize if you've been to the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. This is a model that was constructed in the 1960s of what we think, based on a lot of our textual evidence, the reconstructed temple under King Herod may have looked like. And you can see that it was a vast, vast space with the temple, but also many kind of secondary structures, accompanying structures that would enable lots of different activities to happen, both those that were connected to the ancient rituals and perhaps also a bit of an accommodation of some of the newer realities given the presence of Rome in Judea. And that's essentially where we kind of want to move next. Before we do so, I want to treat you to a little bit of a virtual Jerusalem experience, just for a few minutes before we wrap up with a couple of more texts. And here we can see we're looking directly at this Herodian Temple Mount construct. It took nearly a decade to finish, but again, it was the talk of the town, and it really sort of ramped up the positioning of Jerusalem as the epicenter of the entire Hebrew biblical tradition, right? That starts with Abraham, continues with texts such as the one that we saw in Deuteronomy, and eventually becomes more physical through David and Solomon, and then eventually the second reconstruction with Herod. If we were to sort of scan around a little bit ever so slowly, we would be able to look down into the Kidron Valley, and directly in front of us, we of course see the pool of Siloam. So I'll take us there just for a quick look, so you can appreciate what some of this may have looked like. Keep in mind, this is a very artistic rendering of some of these spaces, although most of them are very much based on the archaeological excavations that have taken place since the middle of the 19th century. So those of you, for example, who may have even been with me to the city of David in Lower Jerusalem, outside of the modern day walled city, might recognize at least elements of this view, because you can see the edges of the pool of Siloam today, exposed thanks to archaeology. And this is, of course, where, for example, where we read in John 9, where Jesus heals the blind man by telling him to go and wash in the pool of Siloam. And as I mentioned before, more than likely, in addition to just being a critical water resource for the city of Jerusalem, this may have also been the beginning of the pilgrimage experience for those coming from all around the Jewish world, including the Galilee. After a long schlep to Jerusalem, you would need to bathe yourself, purify yourself, in order to then ascend up to the heights of the temple to give your sacrifices in that pure space. Okay, so this may very well have been used as a mikveh, as a public ritual bath for that particular process. I now want to take us up towards the Temple Mount precincts. Whoops, I went a little bit too far. 1 second. Here's where we want to be. Okay, we are now outside of the gates that would take us into the Temple Mount construct. Remember, this is a fairly new reality for Jesus and the Jews of the time, because not only were there no gates before, but we're not aware that there were necessarily walls before, right? Remember, this whole new compound is taking shape because of the, shall we say, the ego of Herod, really trying to essentially redefine the landscape of Jerusalem. So as we look around, we see this enormous southern wall that essentially bounds the natural mountain atop which the temple stood. But now, because of the expansive nature of the area, there are these support structures that you need to get through in order to actually reach the temple. I want to point out one other space here. If you look just now to the left of the Temple Mount enclosure, you'll see that there is a kind of an arched street, or a street with arches, grand arches over it. That is the major marketplace of Jerusalem. Again, some of you who have been to the southern excavations in the city might recognize elements of that in today's reality. That is where the primary market space took place, which may become relevant in a text that we'll look at in a couple of minutes. And I want to just take us to one more spot before we head into the temple, and that is just a nice bird's eye view from the southwest corner of the Temple Mount platform. The southwest corner, some of you might be aware, is also sometimes thought to be the pinnacle of the temple, another reference to the New Testament narrative of the temptation of Jesus. From this corner, we have a great view of the very expansive 500 by, say, 250 to 300 meter courtyard surrounding the entirety of the temple, where not only do we have the confines of the temple where traditionally the priests would administer the rituals, but we now have gathering spaces that did not exist before in such a way that enabled the pilgrims to come in comfort and to really enjoy the experience. And again, we'll see some textual explanations of that in just a second. But the last thing I want to do, in order for us to just get a bit of a close-up here, is to head right inside the temple, something that we never would have been able to do were we alive at the time of Jesus, because it was beyond the confines of the average Jew, of the average Israelite. Here we are heading into what is known as the courtyard of the men. The outside courtyard was known as the courtyard of the women. And so here, only the men who have purified themselves would be able to enter in and offer up their sacrifices to the priests. And as we now have entered into the space that is beyond the reach of your average Israelite, you are able to, if I can get us to the right angle, here we are, you can sort of look up at the ramp where the sacrifices would have taken place. Okay, so here we are on the altar just outside the temple itself. And we'll take a quick look, of course, inside the temple, somewhere that even some of the Levites didn't get to go, through the curtain itself and into the room where we have, for example, the candelabra, known as the menorah, the symbol of the eternal presence of God inside the sacred dwelling place of God. And right in front of you now, you can see the incense table with the incense, and of course the table of the showbread. Many of the traditions that are outlined in the Hebrew verses of the Torah as part of this ancient tradition. Again, remember, the overarching sort of idea here is that we're countering rabbinic interpretation by looking at the preservation of some of these age-old traditions. If we were able to go through the second curtain, we would find ourselves inside the area where the Holy of Holies once stood. But of course, in the second temple of King Herod, we kind of have to assume there was nothing in there, because more than likely it disappeared with the destruction of the first temple at the hands of the Babylonians. All right, we only have a couple more quick minutes before we need to open up for questions and answers. So I just want to go back to, if I can find it here, my presentation. And hold on, we don't want this. Here we go. Okay, couple of quick texts just to remind ourselves sort of how the temple, the construct, the reality of that beauty in Jerusalem may have been very relevant to Jesus. These texts, I'm sure you know well, we can read them quickly. From Luke chapter 2, after 8 days had passed, it was time to circumcise the child, and he was called Jesus. When the time came for purification, according to the law of Moses, they brought him up to Jerusalem to present him to God. As it is written in God's law, every firstborn male shall be consecrated as holy to God, and they offered a sacrifice according to what is stated in God's law, a pair of turtle doves or 2 young pigeons. And I just threw on the page for fun some of the Hebrew biblical kind of root texts where this comes from. Exodus 13, of course, saying, consecrate to me every firstborn, man and beast, the first issue of every womb among the Israelites is mine. This is where we get the idea of dedicated your firstborn to God. We don't know that it actually required you going to the temple to do so. We have no evidence of that in the Jewish tradition, but clearly in Luke, we see that Jesus's parents perhaps saw fit to do it at the temple in Jerusalem. And then, of course, in Leviticus, we read about the sacrifices. We won't go through the text, but we read about the sacrifices that one must offer, essentially as a way of kind of completing this miraculous process of birth. And so we see here the pigeon or the turtle dove being offered as an offering after the period of purification, just as we read in 2nd chapter of Luke. And now another section of Luke chapter 2, we read every year his parents went to Jerusalem for the festival of Passover, and when he was 12 years old, they went up as usual for the festival. Again, another indication that Jesus was clearly involved through his family and ancestral tradition of the temple rituals. It was not something that even the most aggressive of rabbis or teachers or scribes or Pharisees, to use the word we explored last week, would forego. There's not necessarily anything contradictory about holding on to your ancient tradition while at the same time maybe breaking out of the mold a little bit in order to interpret your way into some sort of peaceful integration, right, into the Roman world. And maybe one last text we'll look at here from Matthew 21, given that I showed you the marketplace outside of the actual Temple Mount courtyard in Herod's new construct. We read in Matthew 21 that when Jesus entered Jerusalem, the entire city was filled with excitement, saying, "Who is this?" The multitude replied, "This is Jesus, the prophet of Nazareth in the Galilee." Jesus then entered the temple area and drove out all who were buying and selling there, and overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves. He said to them, "It is written, my house will be called a house of prayer, but you are making it a den of thieves." Maybe here Jesus is simply trying to distinguish in a way that reflects his rabbinic personality of finding that very, very difficult boundary, right, between preserving the sacred history of the Jewish people, i.e., a courtyard or a space that is meant to be dedicated toward the sanctity of God and the ritual of sacrifice that we are commanded to partake there, whereas just outside that boundary, it is obviously permitted to engage in the more mundane actions of the economy, of money changing, whatever you want to do. So it's not a question of what's right and what's wrong. It's more of trying to draw lines to be able to navigate these two worlds. Something that I think in a very positive way, Jesus sort of lived, right? That was a lived experience for him, as we can see from the texts, very much engaging in the age-old traditions of the temple and the rituals described in the earlier Jewish texts, while at the same time also engaging in rabbinic interpretation, challenging other rabbis, just like we saw in the Talmudic texts, but we also see it in the New Testament texts, and really trying to forge his path forward, given all of these external stimuli that are challenging on both sides. You remember a couple of weeks ago, we looked at the different communities, sorry, this may have been last week, where we see some of the tension developing within that Jewish world between Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, Zealots, etc. So every individual, we have to assume, like Jesus, was trying to forge that path, figuring out the best way forward. I think we'll probably end there and open it up for questions and answers. And we'll kind of next week, with the last session of this course, we'll try to kind of wrap up a lot of the elements that we've brought together, and also take a specific look at the space of the of the synagogue as sort of a new model for perhaps temple, but also for kind of community strength, and how that is going to, post-temple, move the Jewish community forward in a way that will create a new rabbinic tradition of leadership, as well as help give birth to what we will eventually call Christianity. And we start to see Jesus as this kind of savior, Christ Messiah figure, as opposed to just Jesus the Rabbi. We'll save that for next week.
Thank you very much, Jared, for this beautiful presentation. And we have few questions, actually, many questions. The first one is, are the three rabbinic responses that you were sharing at the beginning of the presentation could make a great starting point for discussing the Jewish attitude in the country, in Palestine, Israel today?
Is that a question or a statement?
It's both. What do you think about it?
I totally agree. I don't really have a lot to say about that other than I completely and wholeheartedly agree. What I will add is just a very personal comment in that, and some of you who know me a little bit, this won't surprise you at all. But as a religious Jew, as somebody who came to my Jewish identity a little bit later in life than I may have liked, one of the things that attracted me most to my Jewish tradition and trying to engage more and really take on more of an observant role within my Jewish community was specifically this concept of rabbinic disputation. I love the fact that nobody in Jewish history has ever agreed with anybody else. And so it really invites the outsider in to become part of that conversation, because you don't need to feel like you're on the right side of the law, because according to the rabbis, apparently everybody was on the right side of the law, just only according to that particular rabbi. And so it's a wonderful way to kind of open up the door, especially for me personally, and really feel that arguing with your tradition, hopefully for the sake of understanding it, obviously not to prove everybody else wrong, but really to understand it better, to dig in deeper, is a way to very much embody Jewish spirit. And I would say that that definitely should continue for all time, including in spheres that may not seem perhaps wholly Jewish, right? Or purely Jewish, like modern day politics of the state of Israel. So I definitely very much embrace that. And I am often trying to apply it both in my worlds as a teacher, but also in my worlds as a parent, as an educator, as an activist. I try to apply that rabbinic principle to everything in life, to engage in these very respective dialogues and even constructive disagreements in order to really learn more and dig at the heart of whatever issue is on the table.
Thank you. Another question, do the Talmudic quotations justifying some assimilations to Roman culture date from before 70 Common Era, just after and up to Bar Kokhba, and then sometimes after, when assimilation was the only practical reality?
Wow, that's a big topic all unto itself. The easy answer is that this rabbinic world is not the first generation within Jewish history to deal with the possibility of assimilation or integration. I'll just add that on because I think that there's a very blurry line between those two, and that is a constant challenge. We see it for sure going all the way back to the early Greek Empire, but I think we could easily argue that it's present throughout all of the Hebrew Bible. If we just look, for example, at the tribes of Israel when they come into the Promised Land, and some of them kind of stick to monotheism, and others start to integrate into the Canaanite peoples and start to worship their gods. And there's a bit of a give and take there. King David, for example, spent a lot of time with the Philistines. So it's not completely a foreign subject to this whole nature. It is definitely going to continue beyond the destruction of the temple, beyond Bar Kokhba. To a certain point, it's going to take on kind of a new experience where, at least up until the destruction of the temple and maybe the Bar Kokhba rebellion, there's a sense of continuing some form of autonomy of Judaism while dealing with this challenge of integrating into an increasingly stronger foreign empire or foreign presence. Obviously, once the temple is gone, once Jerusalem is destroyed, and once the Bar Kokhba revolt fails in the 2nd century of the Common Era, the Jews essentially lose a lot of that kind of historical rooting, at least within the power structure. They're still living in the land, they still have their traditions, but they're not really as relevant as they once were in terms of some sort of control over their own fate. And so integration becomes all that much more important. And I think many scholars would argue that's one of the reasons why Rabbinic Judaism took over, because they had already developed the tools and they had already laid the foundations for the conversation for Jews to be able to integrate into those worlds around them, especially at a time where they really didn't have much of a choice. And at the same time, they were enabled and empowered to preserve the traditions because of that interpretive ability. They weren't trying to just assimilate. They weren't ditching their identity and simply joining somebody else's club. They were able to take their Jewishness and even move to faraway lands, integrate into other cultures, but still think of themselves as Jews. Obviously, it didn't always succeed. There were many people who left the fold, and obviously that is one of the forks in the road where we start to see a distinction between Jews who were following one rabbi or another and the Jews who eventually are going to follow the rabbinic figures, the disciple figures, and become the first generations of self-described followers of Christ or Christians.
Okay. Another question, how would the Solomon's temple have compared to Herod's rebuilt temples in terms of size, shape, etc.? And would Solomon's temple have been large and beautiful in relationship to the much smaller population in its time compared to Herod's Jerusalem?
Wow, interesting question. Thank you. So certainly one of the things that we glean from Josephus's comments on Herod's temple was that the reconstruction was largely to try to bring back the glory of Solomon's temple. And so we have to assume that the temple itself was either of similar or maybe of greater size than Solomon's temple, but definitely reminded folks of what they might know in their mind as Solomon's temple, right? It's important to remember that Solomon's temple, the only evidence that we have of it is in the biblical texts. There is no archaeology of Solomon's temple. There is no archaeology of anything that surrounds Solomon's temple. So we don't even know whether it in fact existed. If we believe, if we trust history, then I'm perfectly happy accepting that it existed, but we only know from the description in the Hebrew Bible. The big difference, which I want to accentuate because we saw the visual in today's class, was everything around the temple. Right, with the description, the very vivid and detailed description we have in the Hebrew biblical text of Solomon's temple, there are no surrounding courtyards, there are no major walls, there are no beautiful architectural elements, nothing at all of the detail that Josephus goes into from that first temple period. So in a sense, we would have to say that on the whole, as an institution, Herod's temple far exceeds anything that Solomon's temple could have ever hoped for, simply because of all of the accommodating infrastructure. Herod literally rebuilds the mountain of Jerusalem and then covers it with all sorts of new elements that never had existed before, and to be blunt, were not necessary for that temple tradition to continue. Between self-glorification, which was something that is, very Herod, but also glorification of Jerusalem, glorification of, just the city as a model that Herod perhaps is trying to show off to his Roman, patrons. There's a lot to be said for why that may have taken place, and certainly the Jewish population seemed to enjoy it, but it was by and large unnecessary, but it definitely created a visual and a physical experience that was far beyond anything we can imagine from the description we have of Solomon's temple.
Thank you. Another question, has anyone compared the size of the gathering spaces with the room needed for the male population to assemble in the temple?
So again, we're working with very, very limited historical data. We only have, we largely rely on Josephus for many of the most relevant descriptions of Herod's temple, the realities in Jerusalem at the time, the celebrations of the pilgrimage festivals. There's a little bit of kind of a disconnect between the numbers of the Jewish population at the time versus the space that was available to congregate in. It's pretty clear that there's no way you could gather the entire Jewish nation at that moment in history atop the mountain, even though Herod had done an amazing job literally expanding the space on top of that mountain. But we also have to assume that simply life didn't always allow for people to fulfill the commandments in such a pure, kind of honest way as we might have wanted. We know that there were many, many people all around the Jewish world who simply did not make regular pilgrimage to Jerusalem 3 times a year. It was almost an unbearable burden for your average Jew, especially when you're coming from great distance, when you live in a small town with little resources. Maybe you don't have an occupation that can sustain such a journey, especially being away from your home or your business for so long. The practical implications were quite ominous. And so more than likely, there was not a need to accommodate that large a population, although we do have to assume that when it came time for Passover, for Shavuot, for Sukkot, that the construct of Herod's temple courtyards was probably bursting at the seams, partly also because we didn't have time to look at this in the diagram, but some of you may be familiar with the term courtyard of the Gentiles, meaning that within that Temple Mount construct, the new reality, thanks to King Herod, it wasn't just people of the Jewish tradition. It was also onlookers, tourists, curious Romans, basically lots of folks that were not a part of that tradition, who may have been gathering there simply to be a part of the action, to witness, something that they had heard about for generations, who knows? And so there was that added complication of catering to the outside world, as well as this, the internal construct of Jewish tradition.
Okay. And we don't have time for all the questions, but I will ask a last question, Jared. There is
Sure.
a newly excavated ruin found in the west of Jerusalem that has the same dimension as the Jerusalem temple, and is thought to have possibly been an alternative temple. How might it have interacted with or competed with the Jerusalem temple?
That is an amazing question. If you haven't been reading the news, over the last number of years, there have been some intense excavations in the area of Motza, which is just west of the city, the modern day city of Jerusalem. It's actually a considerable distance from the ancient city of Jerusalem, given that you would have been traveling on foot. And indeed, they have discovered some sort of enormous temple-like structure there. And the jury is still very much out. There has been a few things that have been written about it, but we simply do not yet know enough to know exactly what that structure was used for. So there are theories that are starting to emerge that it may have been a companion temple or a competing temple. We're not sure if it was a temple that was strictly in line with the Judean tradition. Maybe it was somebody else's tradition. There are lots of different possibilities. What I would encourage, if you're interested, is to simply, pay attention to archaeological news or to the general media. You can Google Motza or temple, Motza temple, M-O-T-Z-A, and read up on it and see, what the different options are. But there's too much information and not enough kind of consensus yet to be able to really comment in any more detail on what that was. But it's exciting.
Thank you very much, Jared. Thank you very much for this your presentation, and we are looking forward to having you with us next week for the last
Thank you.
session. And now, so I'm going to leave the floor to Father Jean-Paul that will lead us into a spiritual reflection. You have to unmute yourself, Father Jean-Paul.
Jared, listening to you is oftentimes like trying to drink from a fire hydrant, where, as you just said, a lot of information that flows forth. But I was very taken by just your last comment. You know, there's so much information and not enough consensus. And so what it really seems like is that part of that rabbinic tradition is very much rooted and grounded in that ongoing dialogue over information that is acquired, that's understood, that comes about through dialogue, through debate. So really, just on behalf of all of us, thank you for your presentation and for clarifying for us the various elements involved in this ongoing tradition of conversation. One of the things that strikes me with all of this is we're dealing with tradition, and how does tradition, in the face of dominant cultures like the Roman culture, how does it adapt? How does it accommodate? I think it applies for us today as well, in terms of our own traditions. How do we accommodate? How do we embrace? How do we reject? How do we entrench? So those are a few of the things that go through my mind. And so as I share with you some of my own thoughts and reflections from things that come out of what you had mentioned, Jared, I can't help but reflect upon this. How do we read the signs of the times? Because it sounds like, you know, from what you have described, that's what the rabbinic tradition has been trying to do, to read the signs of the time. How do we read the signs of our time in the here and now, and see in this light of tradition our faith practices? So in this rabbinic tradition, how did they allow their faith practices and beliefs to be relevant in a culture that was really being so heavily influenced by Roman culture? How do we allow our own faith practices and our own beliefs to be relevant and meaningful, given all of those things that press upon us? Do we adapt? Do we entrench? Do we abandon? Do we reform? Do we accommodate? So as I reflect upon Scripture and our faith traditions, I see a Jesus who in his day and age was really trying to engage in a larger conversation within his religious tradition. He was raising questions, issues, or perceptions that were trying to deepen an understanding of the depths of God's love. And so what he encountered, as we do in our present day and age, was a certain perhaps rigidity amongst the traditionalists, those that would say the law says this, there's no shades of gray here, this is the way it is. Or perhaps the other extreme of a mentality of being overly adaptable and accommodating to a dominant power structure, even to the point of maybe losing a sense of tradition, losing a sense of identity. And so Jesus, I think, was really coming out of a very strong faith tradition. He was engaged in a conversation with that tradition as well. He was giving a new understanding to faith traditions according to the science of his time. So something that I see and wonder about is this whole notion of tradition. the lived reality of our faith creates certain patterns or practices that have become our tradition. And this usually comes about through the acquired wisdom of a lived reality of faith. So I can't help but also think, is tradition flexible? Is tradition meant to be adaptable? Or what happens when tradition remains rigid? If we look at the earliest apostolic times and the first several hundred years of the growth of Christianity, we see some practices of adapting and the formation of traditions. A shift from women deacons who assisted with the baptism of women and assisted with the various women's communities. A shift from active faith communities towards a growth of monasticism, a shift from even the whole notion of confession, confessing to a recognized holy elder, and confession being with monks or with identified clergy. And so therefore, traditions being adapted and becoming new norms. And yet, throughout the centuries, there has also been that ongoing conversation and dialogue about traditions being formed or adapted, or the conflict between traditions rigidly accepted, thus eliminating conversation. One of the people that I see as one who was rooted and grounded and formed in religious tradition, and yet adapted that religious tradition into a new understanding that came from an outside source, was Nicholas Black Elk. Nicholas Black Elk was a Lakota holy man and had a very powerful vision as a 9 or 10-year-old young man. Right now, his cause for canonization is being advanced through the various offices in Rome. As a very influential traditional holy man amongst the Lakota people, Native American people, he converted to Christianity and he became a major catechist at a time when the catechists were really the ones who had a major role in the teaching of the faith, of building up a faith community, preparing people for sacraments.
You're mute again, GP.
All right, thank you for letting me know that. Where did you lose me? Anyway, the tradition of the catechist was really one of preparing people for the sacraments, those who were reconcilers in the community, but those who also assisted the community to bridge the gap between a traditional spirituality and how they understood traditional spirituality now being presented in another way, in this Christian spirituality, in a Christian language. And so Black Elk really lived at a time when there were also few priests amongst the native peoples. And so the spread and the practice of the faith had to rely on these catechists, those who really understood it in terms of traditional spirituality, who could teach it to the youth, who could make it viable and influential and vibrant within a larger community. Spinning off on that, though, was the recognition that the priests that were serving amongst the native peoples basically served as circuit riders. They were the ones who would come around every couple months to actually do the sacraments, to really verify the work that catechists had done. And as these priests would come around and get to know the various communities much, much more, they were filled with this desire: how do we really be much more an instrumental part of the faith life of these various communities? And so as more and more priests and religious brothers and sisters were allowed to enter into the ministry with Native American people, gradually what happened was that the tradition of the catechists gradually diminished and the role of the priest and the sisters increased. And so that came about out of a holy desire, but what it really ended up doing was maybe short-circuiting some conversation and dialogue. How do we allow faith to be really lived out and passed on a much more local level by local people? And so the traditional role was replaced with something seen as better, but ending up shifting the growth of a vibrant local faith community to something perceived more as an outside influence. And so a tradition was formed, it was adapted, it was tested, it was practiced. Was it re-examined or restudied? Was it really conversed over? So again, I think it ties in with that rabbinic tradition of dialogue. How do we reflect carefully upon what it is that we do and how we do it? At this particular time, we're also entering into a period of synodality. And so yesterday, throughout the world, marked a time in certainly within the Latin and Roman Church, but the larger universal Catholic Church, one of listening, of conversation, of sharing, of dialoguing, and I would even take it a step further to say one of arguing, one of theological reflection, and reflection upon the lived pastoral experience of the people of God and the church. So above all, I think it's really entering into this tradition of ongoing conversation and dialogue in order to understand, how do we read the signs of our times, and how do we address our faith, the practice of our faith, so that it remains relevant, vibrant, and a guiding light. And so is it a time of allowing new traditions to emerge, or allowing present traditions to be further embedded or adapted? So a question, or a couple questions that ruminate within me upon reflecting on Jared's presentations. What are the traditions that I embrace as meaningful and relevant, that I want to share with others in order to make a difference in their life? What are the traditions that I reflect upon as needing a certain adaptation to a new lived reality, the signs of the times? And what are the traditions that seem rigid and restrictive that I feel we need to continue to converse about or study more with a critical eye, all for the sake, again, of an ongoing conversation and dialogue that really allows our faith to be relevant? So with that, some things to reflect on, and I turn this back over to Father Jonas.
Thank you for those spiritual reflection, Father Jean-Paul. So this session is ending. We are thanking all of you for your fidelity, for your presence, for being with us. Tantour's program will resume in February, so we are very happy, and we hope that people will start coming again, and we are going to see, maybe we are going to continue also having some online sessions as well. So if you cannot come quickly to the Holy Land, you can still be with us through those sessions. Also, thank you for your donations. That's very much appreciated. So next week, Jared, it's the last session, and it's entitled From Destruction to Redemption, Jerusalem's Denies and the Messianic Rise. So we're all looking forward to attend that session, and we wish you a good and a blessed week to each one of you. Thank you.
Let me just also interject that we do have a January program, the Hakima program. So please let people know about this program, the role of women within the three faith traditions. Encourage people to really seriously consider attending it and participating within it.